welcome to your deep dive. Today we're headed to Liverpool, but forget the Beatles, forget Anfield.
Right.
We're going deep into the city's underbelly, the criminal underworld, and to do that, we're relying on one raw and unfiltered source, Darren Gee.
Yeah.
Now, you might be thinking, Darren Gee, why?
Well, whether you agree with G or not, his story, it gives us this really fascinating peek behind the curtain of organized crime. And he really doesn't hold back, especially when it comes to like these codes of conduct, the consequences of breaking them. And the thing he seems most fired up about, informants.
Okay, so let's unpack all of this. First things first, who is Darren Gee?
So from what we can gather, he's a former figure in Liverpool's underworld. And in this YouTube video, he is not shy about naming names. He calls out Scousers.
And for our listeners who don't know, Scousers is local slang for?
Scousers is local slang for Liverpool criminals.
Gotcha.
And he claims that they're not just wreaking havoc on, their home turf, but across the UK, Birmingham, Manchester, even up to Scotland.
And he doesn't just name them. He calls them rats.
Yeah.
And he seems especially disgusted by those who use kids from other cities, to do their dirty work and then, profit off of those communities, turn around and claim to care about them.
It's really interesting because his anger, it exposes this inherent hypocrisy within organized crime, and he makes this really clear distinction between what he sees as, the real gangsters, like the Clarke brothers, who he believes operated by a certain code, versus this newer generation who he sees as way more ruthless, way more dangerous, and way less principled because they exploit vulnerable youth.
And that brings us to, I think, the heart of it, the informants. Gee drops this bombshell, claims he has firsthand knowledge from his own trial about a man named Tony Christian, a.k.a. Yinka.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
So he alleges that Christian was a paid police informant whose testimony led to convictions. But it's not just that, right? It's how Gee describes the entire informant system.
Right.
He talks about handlers, which suggests that there's a structure in place. There's a process, a procedure within law enforcement for managing these informants.
So he's basically saying this isn't just casual snitching. This is, this is an operation.
Exactly.
This is thought out. But wait, there's more. Gee then brings in Christian's stepson, Kevin Whitman.
Right, and this is where his narrative touches on this cyclical nature of crime and raises these questions about, well, what's the lasting impact of using informants? So he claims that Whitman was also involved, that he was groomed as the, quote-unquote next snitch, enjoying this, he's enjoying protection. He's enjoying a level of impunity because of this alleged informant role.
So it's not just business we're talking about here. It's potential betrayal within a family unit.
Right.
Family history entangled with this criminal underworld.
And that generational aspect of it is really crucial because if what Gee's saying is true, it suggests that this activity, it can become deeply ingrained.
Wow.
Almost like a family tradition. And it brings up all these questions about desperation, coercion, the challenge of even breaking free from this cycle, especially in communities that are already struggling.
This isn't just some detached story. This is raw human drama.
Absolutely.
But Gee doesn't stop there. He goes on to say that this culture of snitching undermines what he sees as the, again, using his words, true gangsters, like the Clarks.
Yeah.
Who he seems to respect, ironically, for not ratting each other out.
It's such a fascinating contradiction because on the one hand, he clearly despises how this new generation is doing things.
Yeah.
But there's this weird sense that he almost romanticizes the older generation's code.
Yeah.
Even though both were clearly involved in, really serious criminal activity.
It's almost like he's longing for a different time. Like he's yearning for, I don't know, order, some type of moral code within this world that's just chaos.
Totally. And to further highlight that contradiction, he then calls out Chris Farley.
Okay.
A former, and I quote, notorious gangster who he claims has climbed the ranks within the Freemasons.
And just for our listeners who don't know, the Freemasons are?
The Freemasons are this centuries-old fraternal organization. They're often shrouded in secrecy, but they're known for their rituals and their community involvement.
Right.
So when Gee accuses Farley essentially of using his past, his criminal past, to gain influence within what's supposed to be this upstanding organization,
right,
it plays right back into this hypocrisy.
Right.
It's like he's saying, look, even the toughest guys can turn around and join the establishment.
It's like we're watching a house divided from the inside. But it makes you wonder, if the lines are this blurred between the underworld and these supposedly legitimate institutions, who really has the power
Yeah.
and at what cost. And it's not just about hypocrisy. He goes even further. This guy, he highlights a specific incident from Farley's past.
Right. He brings up the tragic overdose of Farley's own daughter, an event that Farley himself publicly attributed to the very drugs that he was allegedly, distributing.
That's a heavy accusation,
Yeah,
to say the least.
absolutely.
And, Farley has seemingly tried to turn his life around after this, even, going as far as attributing his daughter's death to his own, criminal enterprise. But he's not buying it.
It really makes you question, like, what is redemption in this world? What is accountability?
Yeah.
Has Farley genuinely changed? Or is this all just, a calculated move to kind of distance himself from his past?
Right.
And even if it is genuine remorse, can you ever really erase the consequences of those actions?
Yeah, and it's not just about Farley, right?
Yeah.
He talks about the countless lives that were destroyed because of Farley's, drug dealing, people
Yeah.
driven to addiction, violence, even having their bones broken over unpaid debts.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a grim picture, to say the least.
It is, and it highlights this really crucial aspect of this whole conversation. We're not just talking about, these abstract concepts of crime and punishment.
Right.
We're talking about real people's lives, real families
Yeah.
that are being torn apart by the choices that these individuals made.
It's about the human cost of operating in this underworld, that ripple effect that extends, far beyond any single conviction, any single act of betrayal.
And I think that's what makes these perspectives so compelling. Even if you don't agree with everything he says,
Yeah.
he's forcing us to confront this really uncomfortable reality that organized crime, it thrives on exploitation.
Yeah.
It thrives on this, callous disregard for human life.
Right.
Whether it's using these vulnerable youth as pawns
Right.
or turning a blind eye to the devastating consequences of addiction, there's this brutality to it that he refuses to let us forget.
Yeah, he even goes as far as to describe this, this specific incident where a young woman was caught in the crossfire of this world,
Yeah.
shot dead in her own home. And it's just this chilling reminder, of the indiscriminate nature of violence and the tragic consequences that can befall even those who aren't directly involved.
And he uses that to hammer home his point about the hypocrisy.
Right.
It's one thing to operate within this world,
Yeah.
right? But to then claim to care about your community
Right.
while you're profiting off of its destruction,
Right.
that to him is the ultimate betrayal.
It makes you wonder if that's what's really driving G.
Yeah.
Because he talks about truth, he talks about justice,
Yeah.
but there's this raw, visceral anger there
Yeah.
that suggests it's much more personal than that.
For sure. There's definitely a sense of righteous anger that's fueling his message. He needs to expose the hypocrisy. He's challenging us to kind of look beyond these simplistic narratives, beyond these headlines that often paint organized crime as this very black and white issue.
Yeah.
He wants us to see the nuance, the complexity, the uncomfortable truths that often get swept under the rug.
And maybe most importantly, he wants us to question the systems in place,
Yes.
even the very foundation of law enforcement. Because when he talks about the use of informants,
Right.
it's not just about, criticizing individuals.
Yeah.
He's questioning the ethics of those tactics.
Absolutely.
He's asking us to consider the moral cost of relying on a system that, while it might be effective in securing convictions, often blurs the lines between, right and wrong.
Completely.
A system that can sometimes perpetuate the very cycle of crime that it aims to dismantle.
It's such a complex issue with no easy answers.
Yep.
Right. On the one hand, you have this need to hold criminals accountable. You need to protect the public.
Right.
But on the other hand, you have these ethical dilemmas
Right.
that are inherent in using informants, especially when it involves exploiting vulnerable people or, perpetuating this climate of distrust and betrayal.
Which brings us back to, I think, that central question: who are the real rats in this situation?
Yeah.
Is it the criminals who turn on each other?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it a system that sometimes relies on, questionable tactics to maintain order? It's a question that, cuts right to the heart of Guy's own story, doesn't it? Especially when he talks about his own trial.
Yeah, absolutely. He claims that the prosecution leaned really heavily on Tony Christian's testimony to get these convictions, and he paints a very, very vivid picture of that moment in court.
It's like something out of a movie, right? Like the prosecution's given this deadline, they got to reveal their informant,
Yeah.
the tension's building, and then bam, Tony Christian. That's our guy.
Exactly. It's really effective storytelling.
Yeah.
It pulls you right in, and he doesn't stop there.
Right.
He even suggests that Christian's stepson, Kevin Whitman, was actually present during these meetings between Christian and his handler.
Wow.
So, again, further blurring these lines between family ties and this whole, web of informants and betrayals.
It makes you realize, these aren't just names on a page. These are real people with families, with histories, making choices within a system that often feels, I don't know, rigged against them. But Yi's story, it's not really meant to offer us easy answers,
Yeah.
is it? If anything, he leaves us with more questions than we started with.
He really does, and that's kind of the beauty of it, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
He challenges us to think critically about, well, who benefits from this whole cycle
Right?
of crime, of betrayal? Look beyond the surface, grapple with those complexities. Is it about justice? Is it revenge? Or is there something else going on here, something deeper, something a little more unsettling?
Yeah, and maybe that's the most important takeaway from, from this deep dive, right? G's story,
Yeah.
regardless of, whether it's true or not,
Right.
or the vendettas that might be fueling it.
Right.
It forces us to confront some really uncomfortable realities about organized crime,
Yeah.
about the impact on these communities,
Mm.
and the moral dilemmas of even trying to, dismantle such a system that's so deeply entrenched.
It reminds us that the lines between right and wrong, they're not always so clear cut. And the pursuit of justice can sometimes, it can lead us down some ethically ambiguous paths. And I think as we kind of resurface from this deep dive into the heart of Liverpool's underworld, the question we're left with is justice truly served when it relies on a system that, that often blurs those very lines?
That's something to think about, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.